Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's talk. It's quite an interesting one, I think. We'll advance to the next slide. There we go. So it's linked to the Gloucester History Festival, and it's all about their theme of quests and curiosity. So what we thought we'd do for this talk is just show some of the material that we have at the archives that maybe not everybody actually uses or actually knows about. Obviously, if we did everything, we'd be here till next Christmas. So actually what I've done, I've just picked a selection of the best things that I think. And so we'll go straight into it. Alehouse licensing records. So the licensing of alehouses or pubs, public houses or inns began actually quite early, 1551 is the earliest, but the schemes used to license them changed over the years, and this actually affected the survival of the records, so that relatively few records now exist. In general, licensing records can be found in the following collections we have. So they've got the quarter sessions, which has got records, plans, building plans, all sorts of little interesting snippets in there. The Gloucester City quarter sessions. So the Gloucester City had its own quarter sessions, as well as the county quarter sessions. And then you've also got the petty sessions. And these, after 1872, took over the role of licensing pubs. We have a few volumes, books on it, some quite good books in the subject as well. But it's one of those things that if you're really looking for a pub owner, you might be hard pressed to find anything, sadly, simply because of the lack of the survival of the records. Moving on to apprenticeship records. So most skilled tradesmen in the past probably served an apprenticeship, which began when they between the ages of 10 and 14, or we know it did go earlier and later than that, typically lasted for 7 years or until the apprentice was 21, essentially. And the master would basically house, feed and train the apprentice, for which the master would receive a payment from the child's parent. At the end of the apprenticeship, the apprentice would have had the skills required to the trade, though not always the tools. And in many instances, the master would train the apprentice up to take over the business when he passed away or retired. Some were arranged by parish overseers and quarter sessions. These were usually for orphans or the children of paupers, and it was a way of getting the children out of the way into a trade rather than have them lying around on the streets all day. And the apprenticeships themselves were drawn up under what's called an indenture. So it's a legal document, and it contained all the details, the terms, the cost, the length of the apprenticeship, as drawn up between the master and parents of or the guardians of the child. So they're quite big documents. Here we see a couple here. These are ones, private ones. These are actually for surgeons and apothecaries. They can give a lot of information about the family of the child. So, it's one of those things, if you're looking for a child or a person, it might be worth looking at the apprenticeship records just to see if they're mentioned. We have registers for the City of Gloucester, the borough, and also Tewkesbury Corporation. These are in volumes. They don't give us much information as the big deeds, the indentures do, but as you can see here, it's reasonable amount of information. You get the apprentice's name, the master's name, the residence, the trade, the sum of money paid to the master, and interestingly, whether that master actually, whether that fee was from charity or from the family. So that's quite an interesting thing to look at. We have this calendar of state papers, domestic and patent rolls. These are ones that very few people look at. The calendar of state papers, the printed papers of Secretary of State relating to home affairs from 1500 onwards. And they contain information on virtually every aspect of this early modern government that we had. So you've got social economic affairs, law and order, religious policy, private official letters, musters, reports, commissions, instructions, council orders, correspondence, proclamations, memoranda, draft, bills. They are a really great source of information. These ones you just hear, there's like the 1640s are very good, for example, for the Civil War period. You can see what was going on. Coupled to these, we have the patent rolls, which are a series of administrative records from the King's Chancery running from 1201 to the present day, although we don't have the later ones. And again, these record sort of the sovereign's will on a wide range of matters, including grants, official positions, lands, commissions, privileges, pardons, and these were all issued with individuals and the corporations. And again, these are really interesting. If you want to know what the king was thinking about something, they do all have indexes, so you can look up Gloucestershire and see what there is. And they are a great way to lose yourself for a couple of hours, I have to say, because I've looked at them quite a lot in the past. You do have to order them. They're not kept in the search room anymore, and they're kept in the sort of safety of a strong room, mainly because, as you can see from the picture on the top left there, they are starting to get a bit old and fragile. I think some of them are now available online, should you wish to look at them as well. Canals, we were blessed. We have several great canals in the county, and the records of the companies that built them and operated them, most of them have survived. So this is a sample of the records you can get. You can get plans, minute books, tonnage registers, and financial and management records. There's a lot of information there to look at. And this is just a couple of pictures here. There's a great couple of people fishing in the lock at Chelford. And then you can see at the bottom there, it's a depth profile across the Gloucestershire Canal, which is interesting if you go for angling down there. And one of my favourites is that letter in the top right there. It actually talks about some sort of finances, but the man has actually made a note about they've spotted Mr. Brunel and his accomplices walking the length of the proposed line of railroad, and this is up the Strand Valley. So, you know, this is a thing that brought an end to that particular canal, the railway going along it. Related to canals, with the canal boat registers. The first act, interestingly, Registry of Boats, etc. Act, which that's what its full title was, believe it or not, in 1795, and it ordered that all vessels using navigable rivers and canals be registered with the county quarter sessions, quite simply so they could be requisitioned as a troop transport in case of emergency in the Napoleonic War, so they could actually take troops around the country to try and block any French invasion. So they've got quite a nice little collection of these, and just 3 examples. So these are in 2 on the left-hand side of the inland barges, the Kempsford and the Recovery, and the one on the right-hand side is the coastal sloop Endeavour. And they're not massively full of information, but they do give you enough information. So if you've got somebody you think might have been on a canal boat at this early time, they are quite a good source of information. And then we got about, I think there's about sort of 100 of these in the collection itself. However, there were later registers, and probably the most important register was the Canal Boats Act 1877. This ordered that all canal boats used as dwellings, or if they had any kind of people living on them, had to be registered. And this was largely because there was an outcry in Parliament about the living conditions of people that were living on these boats. And a side effect of this was that they wanted the boats to be registered to the local authority so children could be brought into the local education system. So we've got a lot of these records in a few volumes. Most of ours are from the sort of the Severn Canal Carrying Company, which ran up and down sort of literally from Sharpless up into the Midlands. And this is the typical entry you see here. So it's got the details of the vessel, it's got when it's inspected, when it's registration, how big was it, etc. And they usually have a little note about the number of people on board. So again, this is quite a useful set of records if you think you've got a water person in the family. Coroner's records, we have an awful amount of coroner's records. They're not very heavily used. So the Office of Coroner began in 1194, very early, and it was their task, with the help of a jury that could number from 12 to 23 people, to investigate any unexpected deaths of any unknown cause, accident, suicide, or murder. Now, before the 1844 Coroners Act, which we'll see in a minute, there were essentially 4 coroners who travelled around the county to hear inquests and everything. They didn't stick within particular areas; they could go all over the place. The exceptions were the Gloucester and Tewkesbury, because they were boroughs. They had their own coroners, and this is a typical example in the City of Gloucester inquest coroners for a chap who was drowned at Maysmore in 1660. Some of them are quite hard to read because the writing isn't brilliant. After 1844, the county coroners are grouped into districts with individual coroners appointed for each district. So it sort of becomes easier because you know where in the district to look. Before, you have to look in one of the coroner's records, and it's difficult. However, sadly, the survival rate of records is very varied, mostly because many of these records were sent for salvage during the war years, so they're basically reused as paper. So there are some areas that have a lot, some areas have very little at all. But potentially, you've got inquest papers, minutes of inquests, registers of deaths, and correspondence. So, potentially, if you're looking for somebody who died, you think there might have been a coroner's inquest, this is a really good source. Having said that, another really good source are the local newspapers, because they frequently reported on coroner's inquests. So the bottom picture here is after the 1844 Act, where they went to more of a pro forma sort of result. They are quite fun sometimes. Some of our inquests could easily make it into the horrible history of stupid deaths. I've just got a couple of these here, which I love. Ada Self, scared to death by cows in Bristol. Literally, she was walking on the street and a herd of cows walked by and it scared her to death, poor thing. We also have this one, lots of farming accidents you can imagine. William Isles here, run over by his own mowing machine. You know, it's the classic thing. The farmer gets out, walks in front of it, something spooks the horses, bang, he's run over by the mowing machine. And then I've got one of my favourites is George Browning, his finger caught in a mangel wurzel scratter. This is a machine you turned by hand to sort of basically chop up turnips. And it must have been still rotating, and he put his finger in it, got his finger lacerated, and subsequently died of gangrene. So, you know, we forget sometimes very simple accidents could, you know, result in deaths, but we've got lots of these and they are really worth looking at if you've got any sort of death you want to investigate. Debtors, lovely quote from David Copperfield, Mr. McCorb here, annual income £20, annual expenditure 19, 6, result is happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20, 0 and 6, result in misery. People who fell into debt would be served with a court-ordered judgment. This is requested by the creditor. It didn't cost very much to get one. And if you failed to pay that debt, you would be imprisoned in a debtor's jail until the debt was paid. Debtors' jails were usually large single-room cells, often in town gatehouses or other jails, and they were set aside for debtors. And this is a great picture from the debtors' prison at St Bravel's Castle, which is in Henry Nicholls' book, The Forest of Dean. So you get the general idea of what they look like. You know, it's a scary fact that during the 1700s and 1800s, we know over 10,000 people were imprisoned for debt each year. So it was a massive number. And aside from the Marshalsea prison, which was made famous for Dickens being in there, or Dickens' father, the most famous was the Clink prison, which had a debtor's entrance in Stony Street. And this has given rise to a couple of great sayings. So in the Clink comes from this debtor's jail, and also Stony Broke, which I didn't know about until I did this thing. So there again, some interesting things in these. The prison term served by the debtor didn't alleviate the debt, though. So you had to pay your debt in full before the creditor agreed to release you. And when the Fleet prison in London was closed in 1842, there were found 2 debtors to have been there for over 30 years. Families and friends could bring you food, and you could almost run a business from there. But it is a real strange state of affairs. And this is a page from the Gloucestershire Court Sessions Debtors Register for 1873. We've got a couple of these registers, and again, it gives you some basic details. It gives you the debtor's name, the date of admission, the plaintiff's name, the reason for the imprisonment, the sum and the term, and the remarks. And I was just looking at this one, and I noted on this one that the sums owed to the plaintiff in the top 3 here, they're not huge: £1, 1 shilling, 8 9 shillings, 9 shillings, and £2, 12 shillings. So about 68, 30, 163 quid respectively. They're not huge, but I was wondering whether this Thomas Cheal chap might have been a money lender. You've got 3 people in quick succession under him. It's the sort of thing you might actually do. So again, it might show you information if you're looking for debtors. These registers are always worth looking up. And I should say, you know, if you use our online catalogue, you can put any of the terms I've used, like debtors register, in, and you'll find the information on them and what we hold, the dates, etc. Elections and politicians. We've got lots of electoral leaflets for both local and national elections from the 1700s onwards. These include sort of pamphlets supporting and denouncing candidates from various political parties, and a couple of nice ones here. Local newspapers, the Journal, the Echo, the Citizen, the Chiefshire Register of Australian News and Journal, always reporting the results of local and national elections. And some of these we know were challenged by fraud, so they get quite long newspaper pieces in about it. One thing that we don't think about today is that in the past, elections often took place over several days, often even a week. And so the results took longer and longer to finalise and longer to appear in the papers. Again, just like today, the papers were very politically biased. But the pictures here you see at the bottom, you know, it's something people don't think about today. So, you know, the state of the poll on the first day, the second day shows you who's been voting, or shows the numbers voting for who. So again, you can almost track the course of, you know, how the people were voting during the election. And like today, broadside songs featured for candidates very prominently in early elections, and this is a song to the tune of the Midnight Harkaway. It's about a Gloucester election, and I actually looked up the tune of the song Midnight Harkaway, and you'll be pleased to hear I won't sing it for you because it's really a complicated tune, and they really had to squeeze these words in, but you know, you get the gist of it. Also, like today, politicians are subjected to excellent satire. We've all seen the Roland's cartoons and the what's his name? I can't remember the name. and names can't choose famous ones, but we've got them locally as well, you know. And I like this one. You probably noticed about somebody called Harlequin Jack. This is all about an election. There's a reference to the Matrix film, an overdose of the blue pill here, and I like the way they sort of put the they put the names of the people with just the first and the end letters. You know, I think the Mr. CMTCDN. That sounds like somebody from Terry Pratchett may have cut me on the throat Dibbler or something, but you know, you get lots of these posters, so they are quite fun to look at. Want to see how your ancestors voted? Well, you can have a look at the poll books. These are lists of voters' names according to the candidates whom they polled. So this is an example from Ewley and Dursley's 1780 general election, which was narrowly won in an event by Lord North's Tories against the Liberal Whigs. And it comes about because prior to the introduction of secret ballots in 1872, electors had to attend elections in person, and you had to verbally state your vote in front of the I can't remember the name of the people who do it, the actual people, the election officers. And these were taking place at, you know, noisy, boisterous, very unruly hustings. So they were, you know, highly entertaining, these things. And these things became public property, really. And people were very keen to see who voted for who. You know, and it's this sort of thing that leads to the rotten boroughs and everything, which we'll have a look at. Having a look at that now, to be honest, because our electoral registration began with the Great Reform Act of 1832. And prior to this, rotten boroughs ruled. And anybody remembers their Blackadder, you get the dunny on the wold, a tuppenny halfpenny place of half an acre of sodden marshland with an empty town hall on it. Population, 3 rather mangy cows, a dat-sound main Colin, a small head in its late 40s and 1 voter. And that's not far from the truth. Old Sarum in Wiltshire, an uninhabited hill, until 1832 elected 2 members of Parliament, which were just bought by the various people. So these things went on. But after the Reform Act of 1832, the county clerk had to make lists of those eligible to vote by parish every year. Their eligibility was based, of course, based on property ownership or tenancy. So if your property didn't own a large enough property or didn't pay enough rent, you wouldn't get the vote. We hold these registers from 1832 up to modern times, though some of the real late ones are actually retained by the various boroughs and councils for their own purposes. And the other thing to remember is that enfranchisement changed over time, so it brought more people into the system. So, for example, the classic example is women, you know, didn't get the full vote to 1921, but women did appear in the earlier registers if they had property of a certain value. So again, it's a very difficult thing to search. The also thing is the registers actually change in how they actually arrange themselves. So sometimes they're done by street, sometimes they're by surname. So again, there's no easy way of searching these. You have to pick a year and have a look. Lots of these are now available on Ancestry, on the Gloucester Archives site on Ancestry. Evacuees, Operation Pied Piper in September 1939 moved 3 million basically women and children out of Britain's cities. They were tended to be placed with families in rural areas and attended local schools. And this is the advantage, because the county council kept lists of evacuated children who attended the school, so they could keep track of them. And this is a typical example from Ewley Church of England School. It's quite difficult. It's quite a big piece of paper that can make it small. But if you look down there, there's a lot of people from Birmingham, Bristol, etc., etc. The dates usually give the list. They give dates of when the people had started at the school and when they left. Some evacuations, though, we've got to remember, they were arranged privately, especially some of the upper classes. They arranged private evacuations, so they wouldn't appear in these records, especially. We know there are 3 main waves of evacuation. There's the September 1939 one, October 1940 for the Blitz, but by and large, people in those 2 drifted back to the cities. These kids left. And then you had what they called the doodle buggers for the July 1944, when London was subject to the V1 and V2 attacks. A lot of people left then. But they are quite useful. You know, if you've got a stray that you're looking for, I mean, sometimes it's worth thinking about, were they evacuated? A quick little bit about farmers and farmers. we've got a wide variety of records that can be used to find out about a particular farm or a farmer. So as well as the more common ones, sort of like the maps, we've also got personal, family, estate records. So these are always worth trying to look at. If you're searching a farmer and you've got the surname, pop it into an online catalogue, you know, because you might be rewarded with a sort of some estate papers or personal records. Probate records are also quite handy. They can show what happened to farms after the death of the owner, and the inventories are fascinating because they can record the livestock, farm equipment, and household goods. And we'll look at one of those a little bit detailed later. And lastly, of course, you've got the parish registers. So these are full of ag labs and farmers in there. The problem is they don't always say agricultural labour. They might just put labourer. Sometimes they put farmer, and this is what I found with farmer, although it's hard to see. So that's some floods defences. We live alongside the Severn, been floods in the county for thousands of years. The most famous ones, 47 and 2007. We have one large single collection about floods, the Gloucestershire Court of Sewers, which this organisation from the 1500s oversaw the care and repair of drainage works along the Severn estuary, mainly on the east bank, although there's a little section on the west bank around Newham and all that they looked after. This is a typical extract from the earlier record. It records the straightening of a channel at Barclay Pill. There's lots of little words they use to describe various channels. So a through in this instance is a pill. If you don't want to pill it, it's pill. It's a stream leading into the river. It opens out at the end, but you'll find words like rhymes and rhymes, etc. There's all sorts of things. But basically, this sort of commission of sewers, they would look at things, think, okay, we need to improve that. Who owns the land? It's those two, we'll charge them, which is what this instance. And of course, moving on later, we've got lots of documents which relate to event the floods in recent and sort of semi-historical times. Lots of bodies have drainage boards involved in creating and maintaining flood defences. So you've got those sorts of records to look at. But again, by and large, the best information comes from newspapers. As you can see from these images, these are all from the sort of the 1947 floods, although the 1947 flood, with the picture in the middle there, I don't think it is, because that's a Triumph Herald, and that wasn't around in 1947. So I think that one and some of these might actually be the 63 floods, which were famous after the hard winter. Everything melted and everything got flooded again. A little bit about free miners in the forest. You've got a forester. He might be a free miner. So since the 1300s, under royal decree, any man over 21 born within 100 of St Bravils, and you can see the area there on the map, if they'd worked for a year and a day underground, they could become a free miner. The free miners basically had the right to mine coal, iron, and stone anywhere within the 100 of St Bravils. A bit more complicated now, but back then you could literally just drive a pit. To open the personal mine or gale, the miner had to apply to the gatherer, who's the official who represents the crown for the forest. And we're lucky with the forest because it's a royal forest. We've got lots of royal records, as it were. These mines, typically known as drift mines or adits, usually worked by one or two miners. It's a few exist today. Hopewell Colliery is a great one if you're interested to go visit it. But however, 5 larger collieries did exist, and these were on the side of real big pits. And the reason they came about is simply because the Dean Forest Mines Act of 1838 allowed free miners to sell their gales to industrial miners, but they had to keep this on a register. And so these are some of the records we have. A little picture there of the classic forest miner from Newland, and a little badge there from Eastern United Colliery. That was on a miner's lamp can that I found in an old house. I lived in the forest. So among the records we've got for free miners, the applications, they are probably the most interesting. There's lots of them, and basically every free miner who's actually applied to open a gale, they've looked at this and they've had to fill this form in, and that's registered. So we've got lots of those, and we've got an index for that you can use. But we've also got sort of other things: gale books, register of applications, ledgers, coal and iron line ledgers, lots of great information. The plans of the coal and iron mines and workings, they are really interesting. This is a typical one. This is for Shape Mantle Mine, which was one of the bigger pits. But you can see what they've done is at the top, it's not the full length, it's about 8 foot long. So I have to reduce it in size here. So there's a load missing on the right left-hand side. But what they did is they did a plan of the mine on a bird's eye view, and then that's at the top. And then underneath, you've got sort of the workings in a vertical section. So you can see, literally where all the bands of seams of coal were. And the forest coal tended needed to be lots of little seams. I think the thickest was what's called the Colford High Delft, which is about up to 6 foot thick in places, but mostly around 1 or 2 feet. So, if you're interested in this sort of thing, and the miners or any of the coal workers, it's worth looking at. As an aside, if you're interested in some of the Derbyshire coal fields, we've got the records of some of those here, the mines as well. That's because they happen to be owned by a Gloucestershire family. Good gamekeepers engaged by landowners in the states to prevent poaching, to rear game birds, control predators, manage habitats for game, and to monitor the health of the game. From 1710 onwards, they had to be registered with the quarter sessions. And from 1785, they had to apply for an annual license from the quarter sessions. And this is a typical one. This is a license for Edward Hall to act as Baron Sherborne gamekeeper for his Cheltenham Manor in 1821. We hold many more like this. And one of the advantages of these is actually is if you're looking for a Lord of the Manor, you can look for these. And if you find the area you're looking for, it will very often tell you who the Lord of the Manor was accidentally. So in this case, we know it's Baron Sherborne. This is his Manor of Cheltenham. So he owned it in 1821. So they can be quite useful in that sort of thing as well. The licensing, we know, brought in a tiny amount of revenue, but it really was primarily intended to curb poaching, but of course it was very, very ineffective at doing this. People get by the thing. Also, this gives you an idea. If you did have a gamekeeper, they're probably going to live in a tied cottage on the estate, so that's somewhere else you could look. And the other thing is, they had the right to apprehend trespassers and all poachers' paraphernalia. And these licenses, you can probably see just from this. You can see down here where it says all such guns, bows, greyhounds, setting dogs, lurchers, or other dogs to kill hares and conies and ferrets, pedals. There's a thing on there just about thing called low bells. I wasn't sure what a low bell was. I went and had a look, and it was basically a very quiet bell, believe it or not, which you could ring at night. And if you shone a torch into the trees, it would spook the birds and they'd fly. So this is one of the things. So we'll be looking at this in our Green Pledge project, which is coming soon. We're looking at all this thing because some of these obviously gamekeepers, we're in a state of our country with very little wildlife because of them. Quick look at graves. Graves were dug and tombs directed by permission of the church and the diocese. Surprisingly, relatively few churches have burial plans. Most of the burial plans are kept in the head of the church sexton, who's in charge of burying people. If you're from the forest, you'll recognise this is Park End Church, an unusually shaped church with an unusually shaped graveyard. But we're lucky because we've got a plan for that. If you're looking for burials at all, parish or church registers, they're in there. And the Gloucestershire Family History Society have a great online memorial inscriptions index, so you could use this to search. And again, it's not well known outside of the area. Occasionally, you can find other things, though, in these realms. This is a great one for the parish of Orr, which actually is an incident of body snatching in 1733, not 133 there. So this is about the body of William Hughes, who was buried, and the body was stolen out of the grave the same night by Samuel Steele, Thomas Collins, Richard Stoneman, and James Lane. I mean, we don't know what happened to them, but I'd love to find out. Fascinating little bit of history there. Moving on to game, hunting and shooting, I mentioned gamekeepers earlier, but there's another set of records which are very handy. So prior to the Game Acts of 1784 and 85, no one could legally hunt game unless you possessed a freehold property worth £100 a year or a leasehold property worth £150 a year. So basically this meant if you weren't rich, you couldn't hunt. So it's all the gentry hunting and none of the poor people. And the Game Acts, even though it introduced licensing for those who wanted to hunt, and everyone who kept any dog, gun, net or other engine for taking destruction of game, whether for sport or even as a gamekeeper, you had to register it with the clerk of the peace on payment of a fee. You'd get a certificate. And again, this is the duty certificate that Thomas Escort shipped to Moyne from the Escort family. So, he's the landowner here, but even he had to get one. He had to get one for his gamekeeper as well. So these were, they were quite serious things because anybody caught killing game without a license or refusing to stow a certificate, automatic fine of £50. So if you're a poacher, as well as losing all your kit, you're going to be fined a lot of money. So there's a lot of records here which we can look at. Land tax is first introduced 1692. The amount of tax was decided on what was called the assessment principle, whereby the government gave each county a fixed sum or the assessment to raise, and they just left the county to how they wanted to share it out between the various administrative units. The records are mostly held in the quarter sessions. They typically contain names of landowners and the amount of tax owed for the land they owned. We think, I presume, that they would pass some of this cost onwards. And this is an example for the parish of Bisley, and it's just a listing. We've got a few of these. Some of the early ones don't survive. Prior to 1780, they're really hard to find. But again, you can see lots of these on Ancestry as well. Jumping right in almost in modern times, World War II Luftwaffe target maps. Even before the start of World War II, the German Luftwaffe was making overflights to the UK for reconnaissance purposes. And, you know, a miracle, they even got the UK public to pay for it because they were selling the aerial photographs and people were buying the aerial photograph of their town or village and aware that they were funding the German Luftwaffe for making target maps. So we've got a nice little selection of these. And the photographs were turned into maps. And they also, Germans just bought the Ordnance Survey maps because they could, and they overlaid the photographs over them. So we've got, you know, one collection with several places in there. So again, if you're interested in this sort of thing, these are well worth it. The Cheltenham Truppenlager there, you can see on the left-hand side, is what we now call GCHQ. So it was an army barracks even before then. Manorial records. You're familiar with manors, a landed estate held by a feudal lord and consists of the lord's domain, which is the lands he could farm, and other lands on which he had the right to exercise certain privileges and extract certain fees, etc. The interesting thing about manors, they held manorial courts in order to preserve rights, the land, and to regulate tenants. So there are two types of court: the court baron and the court leet. The courts baron dealt with the maintenance of property, tenancy, and other estate matters, and sat roughly once a month, while the courts leet dealt with minor breaches of the peace and public order, and they tended to sit twice a law. Interestingly, some of them created bylaws that still exist today. They are very useful if you've got a sort of an ancestor living on part of an estate. They might have fallen into the manorial records. But where are the records? Harder to find. Find out the easiest way to find out if they survive is you've got the manorial documents register at the National Archives. It's free to use. Pop the name of the manor in, or where you're thinking it is, it'll give you a listing. Because some of the manors, very often, if you had a parish, you might have 2 or 3 manors in that parish, or you might have one manor spanning 3 parishes. So they're not the easiest of things to search for. The other problem is prior to 1733, most of the manorial records written in Latin, and their handwriting is quite poor. And even in this example, which is the manor of Kingsholm, you can see there's at the bottom imprimis, there's an item and it's written in Latin there, although the actual item description is in English. So, you know, they are useful things to look at, but sometimes you have to have your wits about you, how you do it. Slurp, as Keith Floyd used to say. Look at the militia. So the militia was the principal reserve of the force of the Kingdom of England, so the backup to the army, basically. And we know militia units have been raised repeatedly from the Anglo-Saxon period onwards for internal security duties and to defend against invasions, or occasionally to hunt highwaymen, that sort of thing. The 1757 Militia Act re-established militia. It got a bit KY before that, as the beginnings of what we now would call a modern territorial army. And it was done at that time as a counter to the perceived threat of French aggression and invasion. So from this time, we get a lot of militia records. Recruitment tended to be by means of subscription, which men were drawn by ballot. But you could substitute delegates. So if your name was drawn, you didn't want to go, you could basically ask your mate to go on your behalf. You'd probably have to give him some money, and he would happily go on your behalf. So yeah, there's a lot of this going on. So again, these records can be handy if you lose track of somebody. You know, have they been enlisted or conscripted into the militia? And you can find full details of the militia records and all our other military records in our hand list, our sources for military history, which you can see on our website. It's a great volume. Anything you are interested in military-wide, have a look at that on the website. Interestingly, we got a lot of militia records in the parish material, primarily because when men were called up to the militias, there was, of course, a real threat that the families would suffer hardship because of the lack of wages coming in. And because of this, the overseers of the parish would give money to the families of enlisted men or their surrogates, and then they would claim it back from the county. And so we've got a lot of these records, and these are typical examples from Chipping Campden in the area of various men, various families claiming because their man's gone into the militia, can they have some money? So these are really interesting records, and there are lots of them. So they're well worth looking at if you're looking for people in parishes. Cricket marriage licenses, again, they're not heavily used anymore, but after Lord Hardwicke's Marriage Act of 1753, marriages had to occur in a church. So none of this jumping over the broom down the pub rubbish. You had to go into a church. So couples to marry had to have either the banns published, so these are announcements of the intention to marry, read at the churches of the groom's parish, the bride's parish, and the church they wanted to marry in 3 consecutive occasions prior to the actual marriage, or they had to have a license from the diocese, and this is what we're looking at here. But to get a license, the bride and the groom had to allege before the bishop or his surrogate that there was no lawful barrier to the marriage, i.e., none of them were married still, they were over age, etc. So they had to do that. But they also wanted to marry outside of the bride's parish, was another one. So this produced a document called the allegation, and they could be applied for just at the day before the wedding. So they're very popular for quick marriages. Anybody could apply for the license, but as a fee was charged for it, they tend to be generally more associated with the upper classes rather than the sort of the lower classes. But there are lots of them around. They can provide quite useful biographical information. But the one thing to remember is that even you had a license, the marriages didn't always take place. So there are some marriages where we've got licenses and allegations, but we've got no actual marriages because it just didn't happen at the end for any reason. We're going to look at the Gloucester Journal now. So April the 9th, 1722, the first edition of the Gloucester Journal was published. This isn't it, this is the later one. Weekly paper published on a Saturday. It covered everything you'd expect: news, home international, notices, stocks, bankruptcies, markets, birth, marriages and deaths, corn prices, royal news, politics, crime intelligence and local news. All manner of adverts plus select notices, sales of livestock, property sales and auctions. It was a big broadsheet newspaper. They're literally 2 foot by 3 foot. And what's interesting is it had quite a large circulation, far more than modern local newspapers. The Journal itself was sold in northern Worcestershire, Berkshire, Carmarthenshire and Wiltshire. And the main reason for this is because it had to sell enough copies to make it worthwhile printing, therefore it had to be sold over a wider area. They're great reading. You can find lots of things in them. If you do come in, you have to look out for the rabbit hole syndrome, because you'll start looking through it and you'll get distracted and you'll see lots of other things. And, you can go there looking for one thing, come out 3 hours later with lots of other things, and they're quite fun to do. I said that we don't really have any indexes for the microfilm or hard copies, except for the Gloucester Journal. You can use Mr. Dunn's indexes, and this is them here. They are absolutely invaluable for the whole of the 19th century, and they comprise a detailed A to Z listing by theme and subject with detailed notes, and they're stored in the research room. We have the 8 bluing binders. There's index volume and 7 sub binders with A to F, and you basically look at the index volume and it says A123. So then you grab folder A, look at 123 numbered, and there's the item you're interested in, and they lead you to a date and a page in the journal. They've got everything in there, from sort of lion taming, to opening of bridges, etc. So they're a really great resource if you want to look at anything you think Mark got in the Gloucester Journal. And I can't recommend these highly enough. They are wonderful things. A quick parish records. It's not just parish registers. People seem to get blindsided by the fact we've got the marriages, the baptisms, burials, and marriages, but we've got lots more in the parish. So church warden and vestry accounts, they're fascinating. They can tell you all sorts of things: how much it costs to hang the bells, to how much somebody paid for a brace of hedgehogs. There's all sorts of material in there. They're very much underused. Overseers of the poor material, again, if you've got sort of people who were evicted from the parish because they didn't belong there, they were sent to somewhere else. Got all those sorts of records as well. Parish charities, where charities were set up to look after the poor people. Very often we've got records of this sort of income coming in, what was going out. Things people don't think about: surveyors of the highways. Parishes had parish surveyors look after the roads and things. They produced maps, accounts, that sort of thing. There's lots more in the parishes, and again, it's well worth looking. And again, put the name of your parish into the online catalogue, and it will be a key number, and then you can look at that and you can see exactly what there is for every parish. So they're well worth looking at. The petty sessions, now known as magistrates' courts, these dealt with minor criminal cases, licensing and civil matters. So typical times they're dealing with drunken, disorderly and prostitution. This is a page from Cheltenham Petty Sessions minute book from 1834. And there's literally 2 prostitutes and 3 drunks on that. This is what they basically did most of the time, although they did, of course, do licensing. Now, generally the records comprise quite a lot. So there's summary jurisdiction court registers, which gives you the name, the crime, and the sentence, as it were. Then you get the minute books, which are clear. These are more detailed. So these are the little backstory about what you see as it happened. So, for example, in the top one, it's drunk and disorderly. In the register, it would just be John Smith, drunk and disorderly, fined 5 shillings. But here, you've got a little bit about it. You've got the actual policeman taking it because he found him quite drunk. So they're much more interesting. But you've also got other things. So registers of explosive stores. I think we haven't got many of those, but we've got fireworks factories, gun shops, that sort of thing. Registers of clubs, certain clubs have to be registered. Juvenile court registers, some of those are still closed in the modern day. Domestic court registers, again, a lot of these are closed. And alehouse licensing. So there's lots of information in there. They're arranged in about 30 districts based largely on towns, essentially. So again, and they always have the PS reference. So pop PS into the online catalogue and you'll see all the what we've got. And it'll give you all the houses, all the places, so you can narrow them down. Again, they're very useful and very much under plans of railways, roads and canals. We've got lots of these. The main sources from the quarter sessions, schemes of public undertakings that used any sort of capital investment had to be deposited to the quarter sessions. They come under the index Q-RUM, and we've got thousands of these, almost. The canals, horse tram railroads, docks, rivers, turnpike roads, water supply, town improvements, 7 ferries and bridges, steam railways, gas schemes, tramways. Thing to remember, not all of them were carried out, but we might have information about plans of them. A drawback with these is some of them are quite large and unwieldy. Literally, they could be like 3 foot by 2 foot, a book. And the way they were kept in the past, they were folded up, sadly. So a lot of them currently go on undergoing some TLC with our conservation department to try and flatten them out and save them, because it's a crying shame. And again, they're really underused, but they are a real fascinating resource. We've looked at gamekeepers and gun licenses. Let's have a quick look at poachers. Of all the reported crimes in a country parish, the most common historically was poaching, and it's a great constant battle of wills and wits played out between the men determined to put dinner on the table or flog a rabbit to somebody, and the hated landowner and their gamekeeper enforcers. But if you're caught as a poacher by gamekeepers or police, you've got dealt with what they call summary jurisdiction. This was simply where a justice of the peace, either singly or with a colleague, could hear cases and pass a sentence. If found guilty, most people were, offenders received fines. There's 2 examples of 2 Chedworth poachers here in 1829. John Musto, the top one, was a labourer, fined £5 for using the gin, which is a gin trap to kill a hare. And Giles Coates, a watchmaker, so thinking he's got some money. What's he poaching for? Go and equip it with a gun to kill a pheasant. These are under what we call the QPC references, and they are rather annoying because there can be large pieces of parchment, small pieces of parchment, all sort of stitched together in top corner. But as you can see, they weren't shy of using a few words here. That's about 2,000 words on there just to say basically he was using a gin to kill a hare or was using a gun to kill a pheasant. So essentially, these are great. They are all, however, on our online catalogue. Excuse me. So if you're looking for Giles Coates, put him into online catalogue, it will come out with that hit, and you can read the bare bones of what the case was. So again, they get great fun to read at, and we've literally got, I guess we've got thousands of the things. So they're everywhere. What's good about the QPC is you also find things for defective weights, or where butchers have been selling meat but using the wrong weight. So that's quite fun as well. Excuse me. Quick look at probate interviews. I showed you one earlier. I'm going to show you again, the bigger scale. So from 1530 to about 1782, when someone died, the executor had to provide an inventory, a list of the value of the deceased personal estate to the probate court. This is primarily, so if there is any financial disputes over the will, it could be worked out how much money there actually was and what could be done with it. They are an absolutely marvelous resource. I can't emphasize this enough. And they can reveal a massive amount of information about lifestyle, social status, personality, and even relationships of deceased people. They're usually arranged room by room, and they typically list furniture, furnishings and clothing, cash, shares, debts owing or owed, crops, livestock and equipment, or tools of the trade. Um, and they provide real flesh on the bones for family and local historians alike. And this is one I found about a month ago, and I've used it ever since. It's a fantastic one. It's basically a farmer, but I mean, look at the detail in this. You know, you've got sort of in the brew house, we've got listings for copper. You know, all the things they needed, barrels and everything. In the stables, you got 8 bags of wheat. You know, they are really wonderful things. Okay, some are really dull. They're like all the possessions, 5 shillings, annoying. But every now and then you will find a gem. So, and again, if you've got a deceased person you want to find out information about, it's always worth checking if they died in that sort of time period. It's always worth checking if they had a will and if there was an inventory. So they are fantastic things. Public rights of way. National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act 1949 gave county councils the duty of compiling maps of footpaths and bridleways in their areas. Quite contentious at the time, still a bit contentious today. They had to follow a certain procedure for making these maps. So first of all, what they did is they asked parish councils, if you've got footpaths in the area, give us a list and show us on a map. They then actually heard objections to anybody. So if somebody thought the classic one is where you get a footpath running through somebody's garden and the person wants to object to it. This is the classic thing. So you have objections, and I quite like this picture. This is one of the records we have, and it's like looks at various footpaths and it's got remarks, action, and I like the thing you see quite a lot. No sign of path. That's the classic thing that's been overgrown, and so they get excluded or included. Once they did that, they produced provisional maps, and this is a picture of a provisional map for Star in the World area, and then this could be appealed afterwards as well. So if you didn't agree with it, you could appeal for it. But then they produced what they called the definitive maps and the definitive statements, and we don't hold these. They're held at Shire Hall. We hold the provisional maps and the other information for it. They are still heavily used in any sort of like public right of way dispute, and they are currently undergoing. There's a big project going on to actually make them definitive, i.e. they can never be revoked, and that's going on as we speak. The deadline was going to be 2026, but because of COVID, it's now an unlimited deadline, I think. So again, if you're not sure about this, they're worth looking up. Riots were far more common in the past than today. And, if sufficient concern by the authorities in front of a crowd, they would read the Riot Act. And that's what this is. You would actually read this aloud in front of the rioters. So the phrase, I'm going to read you the Riot Act, comes from this card. So, basically, our sovereign or the king charges and commandeth all persons who had assembled immediately disperse themselves peacefully to depart to their habitations of their lawful business upon the pains contained in the act in the first year of King George I for preventing tumults and riotous assemblies. You read that, if you don't go home, you're going to get dispersed, usually with hefty amounts of violence involved in this. So this is something we don't really think about today. You don't get them sort of standing out in the streets and Bristol and Toxteth back in there reading this out. It doesn't not done today, but it could still be done. Again, riots are more popular. This is a lovely entry from the John Osborne of Woodland Ridge diary for the 1766 food riots, probably some of the worst in the nation, caused by price rises in corn. And the rest of this actually stretched the resources of law and order. Troops are called out, and they meted out quite harsh treatment to rioters. But despite this, the riots only died down when grain import duties were suspended and the use of grain in food and distilleries was reduced, so it made food cheaper again. But and these riots, you say how bad they were. We've got another great account of them, and you can find accounts of riots in family papers and diaries. And just happened to be looking through one a while ago and came across this one. It's from Aunt Prowse's diary, which is from the Memoirs of Elizabeth Sharp and the Lloyd Baker collection, about a journey to Bath on the 29th of October 1766, halted by rioters. So again, it's part of these food riots, and they basically this carriage was coming basically down from Ewley in the vicinity of Cold Ashton. They came across a flour wagon that had been stopped by rioters, and so essentially the Price family, sort of like the father, had got out and had a word with the rioters, and in the end he said basically, I'm drawing my pistol, I've got my guards have got pistols, we're going through, and if you stop us you will be shot. So again, amazing little piece of history there, which you wouldn't expect to find in sort of a family diary, I don't think. Mention the Court of Sessions quite a lot. It is one of our largest but least used collections. The Court of Sessions, basically, they were local government and local justice rolled into one until the establishment of the county councils in the 1880s, and then Crown Courts took over the local courts in 71. So you had Crown-appointed justices of the peace, and they would exercise administrative powers and issue standing orders over roads, canals, prisons, police, licensing, weights and measures, lunatic asylums, removals to parishes and settlements from parishes, as well as criminal cases. The criminal cases they tried were the ones that were too serious for the petty sessions, but less serious in the assizes. So generally they meant murder or really high-value theft, and they would go to the assizes. Otherwise, the Quarter Sessions would deal with them. The justices sat 4 times a year. It's Quarter Sessions, Epiphany, Easter, Midsummer, and Michaelmas, and they tended to sit at different places in rotation. But when the sessions came to town, it seems to be like a massive party. So they'd be sitting in judgment in the day, doing stuff, drinking and feasting all night, essentially. And again, you can find lots of these accounts in the newspapers of the Quarter Sessions, and you get 3 or 4 columns of type to read about what was going on. Sales particulars, abundant resource, much as they should be. We've got 4,000 collections in the archives that have the word sales particulars in description. One item has 9,000 items in it alone. So it gives you an idea of how many we have. And this is the sort of thing you're looking at. You're going to be looking at sort of, sales of properties. Again, can be really interesting, really useful information. And then sometimes you'll find maps with them telling you what's being done, etc. They say primarily relate to property, but we have these things for other things. So this is a couple of example crops and goods, so timber trees and even wine. This is from Hillfield House at the road from the archives. Their catalogue of cellar of first-class vintage lines being sold, for whatever reason. So again, these are underused. It's always worth looking if you're doing any sort of local history or family history. Did I have an ancestor maybe sold a property that might have been there? It's worth having a look. We look at shipping records. We've got lots of records about shipping. 2 probably most important collections are the Port of Gloucester crew lists. The Board of Trade's 6 monthly returns is another name. So every vessel, every half year had to give an account of what they'd been doing in the year. Basically where they'd sailed to, what cargo they'd had, the crew they had, any births, deaths or marriages on board. And they're a fascinating resource. We've got several thousand of these for various ships in the area. This is an example from 1 year from the boat Sabrina. And you can see sort of the records at the top. It's a busy word. She must have made at least 12 voyages with the crew there. So they're really handy to look at. The other great record we have is the Port of Gloucester Register of Ships. So where ships are registered at Gloucester, it gives great information on the ownership of vessels, dimensions, the rig and the ship type. Again, typically it's the name of the master, when and where the ship was built, when it was sold, and the eventual fate of the ship. So again, these are really important records, and you can follow a ship through its almost its whole career. Many ships are built in Gloucestershire and Shropshire, but other counties feature too, and even got some ships that are aboard. They were made aboard, brought here and registered here. So again, get underused records that are really useful if you've got any sort of ancestor involved in the shipping trade. And following on from that, again, one of the great things about the citizens and everything is you have shipping intelligence. So you find lots of information about ships coming in and leaving Gloucester. This is from the Gloucester Journal. So typically, it's a typical entry. You've got sort of where the ships come from, its name, basically, what it was carrying, who owned that, was it going to sail again? So you've got lots of information on there. And again, these are done day by day, well, I say day by day, paper by paper. So every week you'd get this. Then it's a really good idea of what was coming in, where ships were coming from. So again, it's really useful sort of family and local history research. Theatre programmes. One of the least known collections we have, I guess. We've got thousands upon thousands of programs from various theatres around the country, plus county, I should say, not country, plus sort of from the professional companies associated with the theatres and the various Amdram groups. We've also got programs similar, such as the ABCs you can see here in Gloucester. So again, you want to find what was on the cinema, 4th of August 1963, so you might find a great program. You can also look in the newspapers, they give you that sort of thing as well. A quick at transportation bonds. Transportation of felons went on as early as 1600. So yeah, basically sentenced in large numbers to some of His Majesty's plantations in America until 1775, when the revolution took place, and then to Australia, which is the best place to send all the villains, obviously. Basically, it was a government service, so they employed contractors to do this, and the contractors received £5 per head usually, but they had to deposit a bond, typically £200 as a surety. So they guaranteed that they would take this person to this place for that length of time. If they didn't, they would lose the £200. And if you've got too many of these, but we've got one really good sort of selection of them. And again, if you've got a relative that was transported, it's worth looking at these to see if he was actually transported. You might find some information. Alternatively, if you've got an ancestor, you think, well, what's he doing? How do you get this money from? Oh, was he in the transportation bond business? Again, it's worth looking at. And they're really interesting. And they give you, each bond will give you the sort of the name of the convicts, etc., and where they were taken to and all the details. So again, they're really interesting reading. French newspapers from World War One. Soldiers didn't get much in the way of news. The English papers were always late, unless they'd been posted to them, or if they got them at all. So to maintain morale, the pass on information, units began to write their own newspapers, known as trench newspapers. The most famous one, obviously, is the Wipers Times, but the very first one was the 5th Gloucester Gazette. This is the edition of the first cover here, published by the 5th Battalion, the Gloucestershire Regiment. So again, it was very popular, and we've got lots of lovely copies of it here, and also at the Soldiers of Gloucester Museum. They weren't the only ones, though. Often newspapers were produced by the Royal Navy and Royal Flying Corps, and we've got about 6 examples of the Rencombe Gazette, which was produced at the Royal Flying Corps Air Base at Rencombe in Gloucestershire. So again, really nice little bits of news, 2-sheet size. You normally get a song, you get some news, you get some aerodrome topics there. It's basically gossip, and you also get rumour, another lot of gossip, and there's some really nice things in there, like who Blackett's officer not named left his goggles over Cranham or something like that when they fell out. You get lots of interesting things. They're quite good. Some of the songs are quite good if you can work them to a tune as well. Turnpike Trusts. These were bodies set up by individual Act of Parliament with powers to collect road tolls for maintaining roads, mostly from the 1700s onwards. At its peak in the 1830s, over 1,000 trusts were around, administering 30,000 miles of turnpike road and taking tolls at almost 8,000 toll gates and sidebars. So, very, very busy thing. Gloucestershire, we had about 60 turnpike trusts covering the whole county. Not all have got records that survived, but many have, and these include maps, minutes like this one here, and accounts and how much has been taken in and used. So again, they're really interesting set of records if you've got any sorts of interest in the turnpikes. We've also, of course, got a lot of photographs, generally not with the trust records, but elsewhere, of the turnpike gate buildings. And these are sort of the classic hexagonal shaped sort of thing that we're done. You can see these around the main roads of the county all over the place today. Very brief look at the vehicle licensing record. It's a huge topic, but the idea of giving motor vehicles registration numbers began in 1903, and it was passed on to the county and the county councils. Now it's national, it's the DVLA now. But each county was given an index mark of 2 letters followed by a number, so AD 1, 2, 3, 4, for example. Gloucestershire letters AD, DD, DF, and DG. They're primarily of interest to car enthusiasts wanting to re-register restored vintage cars, but they're quite good for other reasons. This is one of the vehicle registers we got for Gloucester City, and it revealed that my great-granddad, William Putney, had a lorry that was painted green. I didn't know he had a lorry, and I happened to find this just by chance the other day, just looking at it. Oh, gosh, great-granddad. There can be lots of information in these things if you sort of know where to look for them. And again, put vehicle licensing into the online catalogue. You'll probably regret it because there's loads of it. But if you've got a inkling that somebody had a car, maybe got a picture of an ancestor in a car, and that's where you find out who owned the car, etc. We look at World War I field service postcards. We've got a nice collection of these from the south of the county. They were used by soldiers on active service to send quick messages home, and the officers didn't have to censor them. So that's the front at the bottom there. On the other side, you had this pro forma. So basically all the soldier had to do was scrub out sentences. You could then put a date and a signature, but if they put anything else on that, the card was destroyed. We've got a lot from the south of the county where they came into the Mr. Blathwaite's collection, various villagers and employees he had. So there's a nice little collection there. And the basic purpose is just to assure the loved ones that the soldier was alive as well, and also usually that they were getting food parcels and letters from the family at home. So they are quite interesting to read. And finally, I mentioned they're on XFiles. So I've been working here 22 years, and I've seen most of the things we hold and ventured into the deepest, darkest recesses of the most distant strong rooms. However, I was running around a strong room yesterday, and I'd not seen these. I'd never seen these, and they're like the farthest corner of the same deepest recess. You know, and they're not obvious what they are at the start. They're just like, you know, old books basically. I have something you can find out there are court records for Dursley Court. But it just goes to show you, you know, I've been here 22 years and I'm still finding stuff I've not seen. Just think about how much stuff you've got left to discover. And we're just coming to the end with a usual end slide, basically. So if you know, Gemma said it on Teams chat facility is great if you have any questions. Our next event at the hub here is Curious About the Heritage Hub, an afternoon of discovery, quests, archive treasures, and family history on Saturday, the 2nd of September. Again, it's linked to the family history, got lots of information. You've got speakers about family and local history, so both aspects. You can discuss any research you have or any queries, conservation queries with our staff and GFHS volunteers. Mia Bennett, leading genealogist, will be doing some short one-to-one sessions on DNA analysis to unlock family history secrets. And we'll have a great exhibition on treasures from the archives of some of our less well-seen documents. And of course, we've got the Family History Association on hand to help answer any questions, free refreshments. Our space is limited for talks. We do ask, can you book via that website, which you'll get. It just makes it easier for us to manage the talks. And then one of the last little word before I shut up will be our next Secrets Revealed online talk. Will be on Wednesday, 27th September. Secrets Revealed online talk, food, glorious food. And to look at the various foods we've got in our records. And to give you a hot tip, I have just today found a recipe for hot cheese custard. I rest my case. It's going to be quite fun. Thank you very much. Over to you.